everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Do Good to Lead Well podcast series. I'm your host, Craig Dowden, and I'm thrilled to have you join this really important and timely conversation today. As soon as it was in the calendar, I was counting down the days because there's so much discussion around this, and we have one of the world's leading experts on remote work joining us for the episode today. And before I dive in, always like to provide a little bit of background for how Do Good to Lead Well was launched. It came in advance of my first book, Do Good to Lead Well, The Science and Practice of Positive Leadership. And back 4 years ago, at the beginning of the pandemic, people were wondering, how do we figure out how to move forward, and what are some of the key challenges, key questions, key opportunities that we should be considering, and it's important to reflect on. And so what I did was broaden the conversation. And in my work as an executive coach and keynote speaker, I have the extraordinary privilege to interact with top CEOs, best-selling authors, global thought leaders, TED speakers, and so wanted to really broaden this community. And before we start the conversation today with Nick Bloom, just a moment to express my profound appreciation and gratitude. Because of your ongoing support, Do Good to Lead Well podcast is rated in the top 0.5% of podcasts globally. And your support, social shares, comments, feedback, suggestions is a big part of that. And the primary reason is due to the exceptional guests that we are able to bring onto the program. And Nick Bloom is no exception. And as I said, this has been on my calendar and radar for quite some time. I'm going to give a very brief bio and dive right into the conversation. So Nick Bloom is LinkedIn's top voice on remote work and consults with global companies on his groundbreaking research findings and how to translate them into powerful practice. He's also the William Eberly Professor of Economics at Stanford University. His research focuses on working from home, management practices, and uncertainty. He previously worked at the UK Treasury and McKinsey & Company and the IFS. He has a BA from Cambridge, an MPhil from Oxford, and a PhD from University College London. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the recipient of the Guggenheim and Sloan Fellowships, the Frisch Medal, and a National Science Foundation Career Award. He was also elected to Bloomberg 50 for his advice on working from home. And if you're not already following Nick on LinkedIn, please do so immediately. His work from research consortium, all of his posts, the thing that I love, and for those of you who follow the podcast, you know how much I love evidence-based practice. And Nick is at the forefront of that in one of the top questions we keep asking ourselves. So Nick, a very warm welcome to the program today.
Hey, Craig, thanks so much for having me on. Thank you. I'm blushing now at your intro as well.
It's so well deserved because there's so much conversation around this. And what I love is, and that's why I cannot recommend enough for people to follow you, all of the posts, the things that I really appreciate about you, Nick, is that you select the most powerful, impactful research findings, insights from others, and then the research that you're doing and your team is exceptional. And so you continually bring us back to a highly opinionated topic, to the latest science and what the implications are. So I'd love to start our conversation with what prompted you to start to explore remote work, work from home. What was the genesis behind that area of research practice?
Sure. So weirdly enough, I've been working on work from home for 20 years. I have to say, no one was very interested pre-pandemic. Also pre-pandemic, it was mostly fully remote. So to give you some numbers, about 5% of days in America were fully work from home pre-pandemic. That was mostly from people that were just full-time remote. Now it's about 25%, so it's a five-fold increase. And now it's mostly from people that are hybrid. They're working from home on a Monday and Friday. I got interested. I mean, this goes back a long way. I'm actually one of 4 kids. Both my parents worked, and so there was a fair bit of working from home. I'm 51, so that was in the 80s, I remember. And they said back then it was terrible. It was, I've gone back to talk to my folks and other folks that, in their 70s and 80s now, that did that back then, and or Jack Nilis is now well, in his 90s or late 80s anyway, was talking about how it was just so poor with carrying pieces of paper around. Work from home got a lot better in the 90s with the personal computer, the internet, more recently cloud, Zoom. I mean, the one thing that all highlights to me is technology is really everything. So when I talk to execs, managers, they were like, is the return to office movement still going? Basically, if you look over the last year, since the beginning of 2023, return to office has kind of stalled out. It's flat in the US, it's flat in North America, office vacancy is flat. In the long run, so thinking 5 or 10 years out, work from home levels are going to rise because of this continuing improvement in technology. So, this span of history I've kind of lived through has been really useful for thinking about the longer run. So 10 years from now, our work from home levels are going to be better because the videos and the audio and the screens and the software are all going to be dramatically better than they are now.
No, well, and thank you. That's great. And as you say, it's just been so fascinating to see with the pandemic and how there's been so much attention placed on this. And then also, as you said, this happened pre-pandemic, and also the implications of that. One question, and just for the live audience, which is awesome, Nick has kindly agreed to take your questions. So jump in. There are already people clearly who've been on the program before. The queue is filling up, so jump in as soon as you can. The water is warm, so you can ask Nick a question. One of the key questions that I get asked and that comes up in conversations is around leadership. And I'd love to get your take on this, Nick, where it is around positive leadership, the focus of this podcast. Do you find there are different qualities necessary to be effective when it comes to leading remote teams, hybrid work? Is it the same kind of leadership qualities, perhaps certain ones amplified in a remote world? I'd love to get your expert take on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't I lay out a couple of kind of basic facts, then go on to the leadership question. So the typical medium or large organization actually has a mix of fully in-person, hybrid, and remote. So I'll just give you an example of Stanford University, my own employer. So we have across the university, we have 2 huge hospitals, have something like almost 20,000 employees. A couple of thousand almost are fully remote. So who are they? They tend to be people that are doing more like back office stuff. Think of payroll, IT, some IT support, some call centers, data entry, etc. We then have about 10,000 people that are hybrid. So they're coming in typically 3 days a week. Think Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, working from home Monday, Friday. That would include me as faculty. Teaching has to be in person, seminars, presentations in person, but some things like this can be done remotely. And then there's, for us, almost another 10,000 that come in every day. So these are, food service, security, cleaning, transportation, etc. So then if you're thinking about management, it really depends what your team looks like. I would say it's most common for graduates to be managing hybrid teams. And the most common version of hybrid literally is 3 in the office, 2 days at home a week. I think the 2 keys for success for that is, one, I would say coordination / norm / organization, whatever you call it, is you want to get people in on the same days. So when I talk to people, the thing that sends people mad is saying, I came in, I commuted in, 40 minutes, I commuted back, I paid this, I got ready, I got shaved, washed, cleaned up, and I spent all day on Zoom, and it sends people crazy. So fact 1 is try and coordinate at a team by team or either company level to come in on the same days. Now, it doesn't necessarily need to be totally rigid, iron-like, it has to be Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. But you can have a lot more success, say, if you say, look, there are 2 days you've all got to come in, Tuesday, Wednesday, and maybe pick your third. So point 1 is coordination. Some people call it anchor days. There's various styles of it, but just make sure that people are in on the same days. Point 2, the other point actually interestingly came originally from a discussion with Marissa Mayer of Yahoo fame, who's now, very successfully running another company. And she told me what happened in Yahoo in 2013 when this had this media storm about banning work from home. And I think what Marissa did was actually right. And I'll explain, I think her PR kind of let her down, as in not her, but the leaking and stuff. But I think her management decisions were kind of correct. So what she said is, look, and by the way, I've heard this by now like 100+ times from other people. She said, look, when folks are in the office, you can kind of tell what they're doing. Are they at their computer typing away? When you walk past their computer, is it Excel, Word, Python, or is it, Champions League or Netflix or something? You kind of have an idea. So it's not perfect management. It's like 5 out of 10, but it's livable. You can get away with having people in the office, 5 days a week and just watching what they're doing. The problem is that just does not work when you have people working from home because you've no idea. And she said, the basic idea is you have to move from measuring inputs to evaluating outputs and outcomes. So, Craig, if you were my manager, you can't really tell what I'm doing on my Mondays and Fridays at home. And in fact, you may want me to have a bit of freedom. I have some work showing golf playing's exploded because people are playing golf during the day when they're working from home, they're going to the gym. Now, in some ways, that's no bad thing, and it's part of me enjoying work from home, but you need me to get my job done. And so the second key leadership thing is to focus on good performance reviews. So, years ago, I worked at McKinsey. They have ups and downsides as an organization, but I thought their performance review system was very thorough. So, every 6 months, you'd have a very rigorous review with lots of customers, clients, co-workers feeding in. You'd have higher frequency reviews. This is the kind of thing you'd need. So for me, for example, as an academic, I teach, I write research, and I do university service. And there should be some way to regularly assess that to make sure if I'm at home, I may not be working, every hour, but I'm getting my job done. And if I take half the day off to play golf, say, I make up for it in the evening.
No, and I love that. And again, thank you for sharing, and so many positive comments coming in. And there's a follow-up question, not surprised right away. And it's Lisa who says, I think flex work makes sense for certain types of work and certain organizations, but often gets painted with a broad brush of good and bad. So what are the markers of the organizations that do it well on top of what you've just shared? And what are the cautionary tales?
Totally. So it's very much fit to what you're doing, the activity, the occupation. So again, across the entire US, 60% of people come in every day, day in, day out. They have no work from home. We know that. We've been surveying 10,000 Americans a month since the beginning of the pandemic. So think of, most of hotel accommodation, food service, a lot of manufacturing, essential services. My kids, they're teaching us all in person. I mean, as I think it should typically be. So in that case, there isn't any discussion of work from home. And in fact, if you look in those organizations, typically even people that manage frontline workers may come in at least 4 days a week. You may get to work from home on Friday, but look, if you're managing in retail, it's kind of hard to, maybe you have a day of work from home a week, but typically you're in. So let's look at the other 30%. Sorry, the other 40%. My math should be better as a professor than this, 60 plus. So let's look at the other 40%. 30% of those are hybrid. Hybrid tends to work well in organizations where you have a mix of needing some face-to-face. Think of particularly face-to-face is important for mentoring and training, for innovation, and for building culture. So that typically covers a large swathe of graduate type jobs and things like marketing, accounting, finance, product development. It turns out you just don't need to come in every day, but it looks like it's helpful to come in some amount of the week, and how much depends a bit on activities, but just looking at the data from things like the flex index as well, it looks like typically people are coming in 3 days a week, with 2 and 4 also quite popular options. And the ideal week is, in Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, I try and move as much as possible in-person meetings, trainings, events, lunches, leaving events on those days. It's not always possible, but I try and shift them there. And then Monday, Friday, I try and do a bit more downtime stuff of kind of reading, writing emails, maybe one-on-one. So Craig, if we work together regularly, it's totally fine to have a Zoom meeting on Friday. I've seen you on Thursday and Wednesday. It doesn't really feel in person. If there's like 20 of us in a big meeting, it might be slightly easier to have that in person. So that's kind of what hybrid looks like. Then on fully remote, it turns out that appears to work best if it's for graduate jobs, for things that are people are quite far along the training curve, so they're needing much less training and maybe somewhat more standalone. So think of like an elite coder. They've been doing this for 15 years. They've spent 8 years in Microsoft, 2 in Google, and at this point they really know the ropes. They can kind of be left to get on with it. They still, in companies that operate like this, think Airbnb or Atlassian, still often have retreats. So they're meeting up every month for a day or two. So your coworkers. It's not like you never meet, but you're day-to-day at home. Or there's another version of fully remote, which is more common by just headcount, is folks in like call centers, data entry. They're paid, $19.23 an hour. In that case, it's much more kind of, mass. They maybe come in for 5 days training initially, if at all, and then they just start working. There are companies out there that employ thousands of employees that have never met any of them. And it's just a somewhat different setup, like big call centers. So it's not better or worse, but there's probably less training, there's less connectivity. But on the other hand, you can hire people across the US or globally or across Europe, wherever you are. So those are the three modes. Typically, big companies have all three of them. So, there really is no one size fits all. What you choose is very much driven by the activity and a little bit actually by your labor market. So if you're in San Francisco, it's super expensive to hire, say, folks to work in call centers. You may go set that up as a remote. Whereas if I was in, I don't know, Mississippi, and you want to hire US workers for a call center, you can probably just hire them locally because, local wage rates are lower there.
No, awesome. And again, so many comments. I love all of this data. I'm furiously copying this down. Glad it's coming out in a podcast. That's great. And really appreciate the intentionality around this. I've got another question, just bang on, following up one of your points. Nick, Christina was wondering around social fabric and loyalty. How has it shifted with remote work, work from home, hybrid? And then a secondary question, is there a right balance of days in the office around regular social activities to maintain that connection?
That is a fantastic question. So again, I'll give you some research findings, and then I'll kind of come to conclusion. So, to conclude, my suspicion is if you want to maximize loyalty and reverse it, minimize quitting, for the typical graduate, typical kind of manager or professional employee, you probably want them in the office something like maybe 2-3 days a week. There's a big variation, but why don't I just give you two facts, then I'll come back to how I concluded. So firstly, we've been surveying tens of thousands of people, and we know that employees tell us they value the ability to work from home 2 to 3 days a week, about the same as an 8% pay increase. So 8% is a lot of money. Some people are like, wow, that's a great deal. I'd, get 8% less to avoid the, commuting on 3 days a week. Others are like, no way. The best way to think about it is, the typical American European spends about an hour and a half all in commuting, getting ready for work. If you don't come in 3 days a week, you're saving about 4.5, 5 hours a week. That's kind of 8% of your working time, so 8% of your pay. So, that lines up. Second stylized factors, I have a paper that's just about to come out in Nature. And the Nature paper discusses, we did a randomized control trial of a huge multinational called Trip.com. There's 3 big global travel agents, Expedia, Booking, and Trip. Trip is more Asia skewed. Expedia is more US, Europe skewed. So what they do is they 1,500 people in 2 divisions, and they randomize them by whether they come into the office every day, which is people with an even birthday, you're born on the 2nd, 4th, 6th, 8th of the month, or if you have an odd birthday, born on the 1st, 3rd, 5th, etc., you get to work from home on Wednesday, Friday. All of these people are grads. About a third of them have master's degrees, MBAs. This is a very kind of professional elite workforce. What they find is no effect on performance, like nothing. They're not better, they're not worse. They have very good performance data. But importantly, quit rates are down 35% for people that are allowed to work from home 2 days a week. So I think it's pretty clear that going from 5 days in the office down to 2 or 3 makes people happy, and we have a lot of self-reported job satisfaction. So that's very positive, and I have yet another study back 15 years ago. We saw a similar phenomenon, a halving of quit rates if you let people work from home 4 days a week. When you go from, let's say, come in the office 1-2 days a week down to fully remote, it's less obvious. There's now more trade-offs. If you're fully remote, you probably feel less connected to your workplace. It's a little bit more transactional. You maybe have retreats every other month, but you're probably not as bonded as much. On the other hand, it's fantastic for flexibility. And right now, 2024, it's pretty hard to get a high-paying, high-quality, fully remote job. So my broad take on it is I think it's a no-brainer if you have professionals, managers, execs, to let them work from home, at least on Friday, maybe one more day a week. It's a little bit more subtle once you're going, once you've got to 1 or 2 days a week of work from home, 2, 3, 4, there are then start to be some trade-offs. If it were my company, I'm advising, I'm involved in angel investing in about half a dozen startups. I generally, for small young startups, when they're first getting going, they have pretty motivated, fresh-faced, excited employees. They are rarely coming in. They are mostly remote. They're meeting up a lot. By the time you're getting to 50, 100 plus employees, they're shifting more towards hybrid, where they're coming in, say, 2-3 days a week, which is what Stanford does, which I think is kind of the middle ground.
Mm. No, that's awesome. And again, so many great comments coming through. And thank you, Nick, for all these fantastic insights. Here's another question from Angela, who says, in organizations with some members who have to be in the office 5 days a week, and then there are some who can work from home, are there strategies to lessen the feelings of being the haves versus the have-nots?
Yes, so this was actually an enormous issue, particularly early on in the pandemic. So firstly, this is true of every large organization. Generally, you want to avoid that setup within teams. So if I think of a team, you're the marketing team. Imagine there's 8 people involved in marketing. You really don't want to have 4 of them allowed to work fully remotely and 4 come in, unless they're in clearly defined different roles. At least 2 reasons for that. One is, think of the 4 people that are in person. They come in, they're having a meeting. They want to have a full marketing meeting. Now, half the people aren't there. They're on Zoom. If anyone that's tried it, these mixed mode meetings where some are on Zoom, some in person, are not great. You have 4 small heads on one Zoom screen and then 4 people in the room. And, half the time you're trying to listen, the person in the room turns sideways and is talking and walks off screen. You're like, they just don't work very well. That may be a lot better in 10 years. But the tech right now for these mixed mode meetings is not fantastic. I've actually worked a lot with Neat and with Logitech, 2 big hardware and software suppliers. They are improving things, but I'd say, we're still making progress. The other issue that comes up is if you mix it within teams, there's this sense of unfairness. So I've talked to quite a lot of employees. Anyone that's managed teams knows that having a team where it's unfair, there's not, it's kind of like you'd rather not give anyone a pay increase than give half the team a pay increase. It so pisses off the other half that they all quit on the spot. It's like inequity. Everyone, has this immense sense. So this comes up a lot, whereby we had this, an organization I know well was saying early in the pandemic, we let people that were living more than, I think, 30 miles away be remote, and those that are nearby come in. And there was an enormous disgruntlement with people living 25 miles away saying, why the heck am I having to commute in every day, and X isn't, and they're getting paid, blah, blah, blah. So broadly, the advice is, if you have a team, you should probably have everyone in the team doing the same kind of thing. So either wholly remote or hybrid. They're going to connect together. They get promoted and developed at the same rate. You're not going to have a 2-track system. You're not going to have upsetness. If, as Stanford does, we have thousands of fully remote employees, they typically sit in different teams and have different functions, and that's fine. So if I'm in marketing, but there's someone else that does data entry, and I go for lunch with them because they're my friend, I kind of understand. I'm doing marketing, I'm doing campaigns, I'm meeting people, we're having group meetings. Person X, doesn't need to come in. But I think within the team definitely gets hard, and it's something that firms are trying to move away from. At least mandate. I mean, look, you can have a situation whereby some people choose to come in 3 days a week, but you certainly don't want to have some people mandated and hybrid and other people allowed to be fully remote within the same team.
Love this. And again, so many, I'm not surprised. There's just an array of questions coming through, and people saying love the highlighting the intentionality within teams. Such a great insight. And I've got a follow up on that from Kevin saying, love that point about within teams. What if other teams, even if they recognize it's outside, it's a different function, any thoughts around how to broker a conversation, be empathetic in that conversation, anything from your research or consulting to suggest how to have those conversations?
But another thing that, again, it's kind of pandemic, again, important question, kind of a pandemic era. There were times where people said, look, here's another difficult situation. In 2021-22, you created a team of 15 people. You told them at the time they're all going to be fully remote. It turns out the CEOs changed their mind. They're now saying everyone has to come in hybrid. You have 3 of them that live 300 miles away, clearly not going to come in. What do you do? So 12 of them are now moving to hybrid, 3 don't come in. That is genuinely a really hard problem. It has no great solution. There's 2 or 3 solutions that I've heard. One is you just say, look, you're on a slightly different contract. you don't have to come in, but you're going to be paid less, or you're not going to get as much pay rise going forwards. It's sensitive, people don't like it, but they may, there's clearly a difference already. You're kind of, these folks are kind of drifting apart. The second reason, they have a different role with different promotion prospects. They get paid the same, but they're just promotion prospects. They're told up front. So Craig, you're managing me. You're saying, Nick, if you'd like, you can come in 3 days a week. We'd love you to, but we'll keep you on as fully remote. But you have to be aware that this will probably reduce your ability to get promoted because you're less in contact with the firm. A third reason is some companies are just given tough mandates. In a few cases, I'm trying to think, Grindr was one, Twitter was another. They're basically hidden layoffs. So, Grindr was the most high profile. It just said, you got to come in like next week. I mean, they gave like no warning, and not surprisingly, half the firm quit, and it turned out they're looking to lay off half the headcount. And a bunch of journalists said, well, that's why. The problem is that's not ultimately a very good strategy, because guess who quits first? The problem is, if you could lay off half your headcount by turning the air conditioning down to like -10 Fahrenheit, and it would just be so unpleasant that half the people quit. But the people that quit are the ones generally you can find the outside jobs, and you probably don't want to lose. So my suggestion, if you have one of these painful dynamics of some people can't come in, is probably sit down and the best thing without laying people off is probably just to have a 2 contract or 2 promotion structure and have it explicit. The reason I raise that is, think about this 15-person team with 12 in hybrid and 3 remote. If the 3 remote get exactly the same deal as the 12 that are hybrid, the 12 that are hybrid may feel disgruntled. They're coming in every day. It takes time and money to commute. You have to live near the office. It's very hard, but you kind of want to get to a situation where you have equity on this. It also relates to a topic that's come up with a number of startups, in particular, I've seen, that have wanted to go from fully remote to hybrid. What they've generally done is saying, going forwards for the next 2 years, we're going to hire in clusters. So we're only going to hire in Chicago, Atlanta, the Bay Area, because in 36 months we're giving everyone very advanced warning. We're thinking of going to a hybrid scheme, and that gives people an enormous lead that you can move, but you can't change these things overnight because people have to move where they live. And if I'm told that suddenly I have to come in every day, I may think about looking for another job. Given 18 months, I can find one, but given 3 months, I often can't.
No, well, and again, comments just flowing in. Thank you, Nick, for your thoughtful responses. Really appreciate how you're pulling apart complex issues. Got another question from Peter, who says, great discussion. How can an organization effectively promote and preserve its culture when it comes to remote work and working from home?
So again, a really important topic that came up a lot. It's funny, I remember it was a Zoom call. I was about to say it had to have been a Zoom call early on when I was talking to Eric Yuan and a few other, who's the CEO of Zoom, and a few other folks, CEOs, about this. And the theme early on in the pandemic was, well, we've got all this culture, this stock that we've inherited over the years, and it's going to see us through this 6 months of lockdown, and when we go back to fully in the office, we'll revive it. And of course, that never happened. We've never gone back. Most organizations haven't. So I think the best way to look at this is partly in trade-offs and partly in what I call the task-based model of the workplace. So the task-based model says, let's split up our roughly, say, 40 hours a week that we worked, or 50 hours a week, however much you work pre-pandemic, into 2 types of things. One is activities when you were individually working, think of email, reading things, preparing presentations, maybe Zoom calls with people in other offices. That was never building culture with people in your workforce because you weren't physically seeing them. The other set of activities were face-to-face things, lunch, chats next to the water cooler, going out for drinks maybe afterwards if you include that, meetings, trainings, presentations. That was clearly building culture because, in a sense, you're face-to-face. You can say you can build culture remotely, but at that point, if you're building culture remotely, you don't need to come in for that. So in terms of things that are very reliant on being in person, pre-pandemic, we were, the typical person is probably only spending 50, 60% of their time doing that. So the hope is, with well-organized hybrid, in your 3 days a week in the office, you can just about get 2.5 days or 2 days of FaceTime, and so you don't lose a lot. You lose a little bit, maybe, I agree, but the hope is, look, if you're coming in for 3, on those 3 days, we will make sure we all go for lunch, we have events, trainings there. Once you start to go lower and lower, say you're going to 2, 1, or say you're meeting up for 1 day a month, there is a trade-off. You can build culture, remotely, but certainly feel personally that it's not the same. It's hard to put numbers on this, actually. The numbers I've heard is kind of like dog years. So a few places have said training. Some place, a big accounting firm, said, look, for the new associates, they reckon it takes twice as long to train them fully remotely as in person because they just don't pick up as much, or they're not paying attention on Zoom, or they're toggling. So you can build culture, I think, remotely, but there is some trade-off. Why would then companies like Atlassian say be fully remote, or Airbnb, and have people come in 1 day a month? Because I think they've seen the trade-off. Said, yes, it's slightly harder to build culture. Maybe it's slightly harder to train. On the other hand, we can have amazing recruitment policies because we can hire nationally. We can effectively get the same, much better talent for the same dollars. And it depends kind of what your labor market is and what you're looking for. So for Airbnb, they're going to swivel to hiring more experienced coders because it's going to be hard to train these people up, and they're probably going to be hiring more across the country. But yes, my guess is if you're coming in 3+ days a week, there's probably not much of a culture hit. Below that, it starts to be a hit, and you're really thinking about trade-offs between that and other benefits from being more flexible.
No, I love that, and thank you. It's such again, great insights on these questions. And a couple of people have asked this, and I was curious as well. Have there been any results that you found in your research, Nick, or others that you've come across that surprised you, that you thought, wow, I can't believe this is, I'm shocked this is what the findings are? Love to hear those.
One is just how work from home has stuck. I've been working on this for 20 years. In 2020, when we all shifted home, if you'd asked me what will happen to the US economy when half the people are working fully remotely, I'd be like, it's going to be a disaster. How does this work? It would be a fiasco. It wasn't great, but look, we survived. And at this point, where the economy's back on pre-pandemic track, and we have 5 times as much work from home as pre-pandemic. So one surprise has been how persistent and how successful this has been. So to give you numbers, it was doubling roughly every 15 years pre-pandemic. If you plot the straight line on work from home share from 2019 onwards, we'd have got to the levels we are now by about 2040. So we've accelerated about 20, my math's terrible here. We've accelerated 20 years, 25 years into the future on what we otherwise would have predicted. So that's one enormous surprise. The other surprise is just to be clear, is how varied people's preferences are on them. To give you, another just quick bit of data, when we surveyed, again, tens of thousands of people in the US, around the world, actually, Asia, Europe, South America, Central America, Africa, you pretty robustly get across countries that something like a third of people want to be fully remote. They just never want to come into the office at all. A half of people want to be hybrid, and the remaining roughly 20% want to be fully in person. So there's just an enormous mix. And it means if you're, take Apple, if you're Tim Cook, if you remember at the beginning of the pandemic, a bunch of Apple employees signed this petition saying we want to be fully remote, we're really unhappy. I remember looking at it at the time, and Apple has 150,000 employees. Based on my numbers, roughly a third of them, 50,000, want to be fully remote. About 1,000 people signed that petition. I remember thinking, I'm sure, many, many more could sign the petition. The problem if you're Tim Cook is you've inherited 150,000 employees with preferences all over the place. It's like the air conditioning, someone at hotter, someone at colder, but you need one temperature in the office. And so he went with hybrid, kind of 3 in, 2 out, which is roughly, not quite, but is roughly the average. If you want to know, the average person wants to work from home about 3 and come into the office about 2 days a week. So that was the other surprise, how just incredibly varied people are and what they like.
No, that's great. And I think, again, it's such a fascinating study of how things have evolved. And thank you. Lots of great comments coming through.
Yeah. Craig, I was going to jump into one other thing that, again, is research in the pipeline. Is lots of people ask about benefits of this in terms of kids and DI and various other things, which you do see. The group in the data that I look at that seems to have benefited the most, at least in terms of employment rates, are employees with a disability. So we've seen enormous, absolutely enormous increases of employment rates in the US, and I've looked in some other countries, actually, Germany, Canada, Australia, of people with a disability. And to be clear, this includes both mental and physical disabilities. So, just to give an example, someone in my family actually has autism and really doesn't like noise. So, doing very well, but really doesn't like loud background noise. And would be keen to have quite a few days working from home to have avoid background noise. Or someone else, a friend of mine has a colostomy bag and says, look, I really want to be near a bathroom and I really don't want to be more days at home. So it turns out there are a lot of Americans, Europeans, people globally that have various types of disabilities would like to work, are totally able to, but are prevented by the pre-pandemic system of having to come into the office 5 days a week, have long commutes, not have great bathrooms, not have great sitting chairs, not have great facilities. We've seen roughly a 5% increase in employment rates. There's roughly 500,000 more people in America with a disability are working, which is amazingly positive. I actually think is one of the things that's driving the post-pandemic boom. You have all these people coming into work, producing more, paying more taxes, etc.
No, that's great. And again, so many comments of thank you, amazing insights. You mentioned DEI. I've been trying to stay on top of all the questions coming in, and someone did ask around. Nick, would love your insights on what, if any, relationship between working from home, remote work, and DEI initiatives, and how best to implement those in a remote environment.
That's an interesting. I wasn't going to quite. I can give you what I know on so on the remote environment, it's certainly the case. It becomes easier to employ more diverse employees. So actually, I was talking to, I think she was the head of HR at Twitter. This was a while back. This was before the Musk takeover, so she's probably long gone. But she was saying, I'm blanking on the guy that founded Twitter. I'm blanking on his name, but his view was, and the big Twitter view was, Twitter was set up in San Francisco and was totally dominated by Democrats, the employees, and they wanted a more diverse, politically diverse, but there's obvious different definitions of diverse. There's diverse racially, by gender, but in this case, they were very nervous that they were 95% Democrat employees, and they wanted just more political diversity. And so one view they had is if we allow for remote work, we're going to have more diversity. The only fly in the ointment on some of this is to what extent is that impacting the organization? So, for example, if Twitter thinks we need to employ a lot more, I mean, this is pre-Musk, I don't know what it's like now, but pre-Musk, we need to employ more Republicans to kind of make us more balanced. We employ them all remotely. Does that really filter through into the thinking of the organization? Or if they're only connecting in Zoom over work meetings, maybe it doesn't impact things. So DI is much easier to achieve. It's slightly less clear what you achieve, actually. That's the trickier thing. So if you hire, say, a large number of minorities because you really need that in the organization, they're all fully remote, does that affect the way the organization works? The other angle I know slightly better on, because we have some research on it, is for in-person organizations, it does look easier to recruit and retain diverse employees if you allow hybrid. So we had a couple of the survey ways we asked people, would you define yourself as, I can't remember the exact question, it's something like, are 10% or more of your co-workers the same gender, age bin, which is by decade, race, religion, and politics as you? And then we asked them on their preferences for hybrid. And what you tend to see, and statistically significantly, there's a somewhat higher preference for hybrid if you're a minority for one, and particularly several of those categories. So I'm not typically a minority in just about any category, but if it was age, I'm 51. If I'm in an organization, say, of 20-year-olds, they don't need to be aggressive towards me by any means. It's just they're talking about TikTok. I don't know anything about it. They're using, my oldest daughter's now just about to turn 21. I just may not connect as much. And so as a result, I don't feel quite as comfortable going in. And therefore, if I'm offered hybrid, it's particularly appealing to me. And so what you tend to see is there is a connection between somewhat more generous work from home policies and DEI. To put it in reverse, there is a very famous, I won't be too explicit, it's a very famous high-profile organization that's been super aggressive on telling all its employees they need to come back 5 days a week, day in, day out. They're also having real problems retaining and keeping middle and senior female management in particular. So that is a group whereby you often have, childcare, it should be balanced, but, in practice, it doesn't always end up being totally balanced. And so what you see is you lose just a segment and you have a real diversity issue if you're very aggressive. So my general advice is, if it's an issue in your industry, say you're in finance or tech, forcing people back 5 days a week we can recount is going to be pretty costly on DEI.
No, and again, thank you, and so many comments here as well on that, and it's such an important issue. I've got a question from Hunter who says, in our organization, we track productivity data, and there seemed to be a bump at the beginning of the pandemic, and now it's starting to wane. Just curious about, and recognizing this is a big question, any trends that you're finding in terms of productivity working from home versus in office, and any interesting things you're finding in the data?
Yeah, absolutely. So I wrote a review called The Evolution of Working from Home that came out last year. We summarized all the research and everything that's come since I can update on. I think it's really important to break into two different types of practices. So one is hybrid and the other is fully remote. So let's start first with hybrid. So hybrid, I have in mind, you're in the office 3 days a week, you're at home on 2. You're in an organization that's reasonably well managed, so it has performance reviews and has a sense of what you're doing. The evidence there is hybrid doesn't make any impact either way. So, there are upsides of working from home. In fact, I was doing something earlier today. It saves you about an hour a day, and roughly half of that, you can think of 30 minutes you spend on working more. You're less tired. You can focus more. It's quiet. But there are also some downsides. We talked a little earlier. It's a bit harder to, recruit, to mentor, maybe train, connect up. So hybrid turns out to be on average about 0. You can think of positives and negatives, they just wash out. Why is hybrid very popular? The reason hybrid is popular is it has no benefits or costs on productivity, but has huge benefits on recruitment and retention. So go back to that 8% number, employees really like it. And so effectively for companies, you're reducing turnover, you're making it easier to hire, and that saves them millions of dollars. So hybrid on one side is massively profitable for companies. It's why it's stuck, it's here to stay. It's not going away because, in a capitalist system, whatever makes companies money tends to stick around. Then fully remote is a more mixed bag. So there are a number of studies on fully remote. I won't go through them all. They come up with very mixed findings, from big negatives. One was minus 30% to another. Actually, I did, 10, 12 years ago, and plus 15%. I would say it's a bit all over the place. It depends on how well managed it is and how suitable it is. If it's like a call center, it's really suitable. If it's, some more kind of managerial professional job, it's harder maybe to do. The average of those studies may be 0, minus 10%. It's not really obvious. I normally, when I talk to execs, say that's kind of the wrong question to ask about fully remote. You don't really want to be asking about the productivity impact of fully remote. You want to be asking about the profitability impact of fully remote, because firms ultimately care about profit. And the reason they're very different is the cost side of things. So take fully remote. Imagine, Craig, you're employing me fully remotely and I'm 10% less efficient, just to be 10% less productive, just to use an example. You may immediately think, well, look, we should get rid of Nick. He's 10% less productive. But in my defense, A, I don't have an office, saves you about 10% of costs on average. And B, you can probably hire me, somewhere that, is lower wage, maybe internationally. And often these roles are, 20%, 30% cheaper for the same talent. So if you actually look at profit, it turns out fully remote is phenomenally profitable for a whole range of roles. And that's why about 10% of US and European employees are fully remote. Again, it's profitable, and it makes sense for firms to do that.
No, and thank you. And I got a great comment I want to share. Nick, such an insightful reframing of the issue. I hadn't thought about it in terms of profitability versus productivity. That was great. A couple of other people have asked, Steve, Andrea, around mental health and employee wellness. And there's such a huge focus, so much evidence coming out around loneliness as well. And so curious around the impacts of remote work, hybrid work on this, and any advice in terms of organizations when they're looking to safeguard the well-being of their teams.
Great. So again, drawing on the evidence I know. So the first is there have been a number of studies showing that mental health, and particularly use of counselors and support services, rose a lot during the pandemic. So that was a problematic time. That was also a weird time. I mean, it's obviously the schools shut down, workplaces shut down, people are isolated. You also can socially connect outside of work. There's the stress of the pandemic. I mean, over 1 million people died in the US alone. We ran a survey. So I think the lockdown was definitely very costly and problematic. We recently ran a survey where in one of our waves of 10,000 Americans in a month. We asked people, a question something like, how many days a week is best for mental health? Let me ask them, how many days a week is best for physical health? Now, these are self-reported survey numbers, so you can take them with what they are, but what you find is there is just a big range. So about a third of people say my mental health is best if I'm fully remote. And these may be people that have married with kids, they live a long way away, they don't like the noise in the workplace, they don't like the politics or whatever in the workplace, they just prefer to be at home, and I can totally understand that. There's then about a half of people that say their mental health is best hybrid. That probably include me. I'd get a bit lonely, never going in, but then I like my tranquility, peace at home. And then there's the remaining about 20% that says their mental health is best, so they go in every day. In fact, that's probably like my undergrad class. I polled my seniors the other day, and they were like very strongly in favor in their first job. They said they want to go in every day, they want to socialize, not every day. They were like, some would want to take a day off a week. So what I think it tells you is mental health is probably best optimized when people get the circumstances they want. And there is just no one size fits all. So some super outgoing people are going to be very depressed being penned up at home 5 days a week. And they're the people that may have really struggled in the pandemic. There are others that actually, prefer that and find the peace and quiet and, the maybe less stress or nearness to family positive. So ultimately, what's important is choice for mental health. At least the data that I've seen supports that. And it means really the best thing we can have is an economy whereby firms offer lots of roles. So the dream scenario, some companies are offering fully remote, some are offering hybrid, some in person. You just pick your role. Within companies, different teams are offering it. So I think the pandemic has been fantastic for this because there's just so much more variation and choice now. And the main thing is people try and match their job. And I think that's one of the big reasons for the great resignation is, you, Craig, really want to be in a fully remote company. You've got, a ruthless CEO that said, you've got to come back in 5 days a week, banging the table. And you're like, I'm out of here. I mean, it's just not a good fit with me. And you quit and you go work for a fully remote company a lot happier. And that churn happened over the space of a couple of years and people remixed. And now we've settled back down. So that's ultimately, I think the bottom line is honestly is choice and self-determination and maximizes mental health.
No, I love that, and couldn't agree more around that autonomy, as you say, that self-direction around that, and the impact that has. I think that's just fantastic. Another question, and time is flying. We only got about 10 minutes left, so this has just flown by, and I'm not surprised. I knew this would be a lot of fun and so much content that we've covered. So thank you again, Nick. Dan was wondering, what are some best practices when it comes to onboarding new employees remotely?
That has been trickier. I would say one of the usual rules of thumb for big companies, or companies that can afford it, is to try and at least onboard or have more in-person time early on. Now, there are going to be situations where you have to onboard remotely. It's going to be more one-on-one time. It's hard to get people to treat Zoom like a television show. It's just not as exciting. I might watch, I'm a football fan, as in I watch the Premier League. I'll probably sit and happily watch that and pay attention, to be honest, for 2 hours. But there's some Zoom training video about, within 10 minutes, you're doing your email and you drifted off. So onboarding, I think if you're going to, ideally you do it in person. There are a lot of companies, by the way, that when you onboard will have you meet up for, a 5-day retreat and then unleash you, and then you meet up, 1 day every 2 months after that. If I think it's going to be fully remote, one of the things is to make it as interactive as possible. It's very hard to broadcast stuff, which means a bit like the way we use what's called flipped classrooms. So a number of Stanford classes, I do this to some extent, actually. You get people to read stuff before the class and then they discuss it in person. So there's not much point, chalking up, the old thing about what I chalk up on the board goes through, from my head through the board, through your head onto the paper, and it doesn't stay in either of our heads. It's just like gets forgotten about. Well, in teaching, now you get students to read stuff before, and the classroom is the discussion. So it's a bit like onboarding. It's probably best to get people to read the material and say in groups of 5, but then going to discuss it. We're not going to do any onboarding presentations, so they're going to be relatively fast. And yes, the other thing is to the extent you can have retreats reasonably early on. There's an old, very famous advert. You can hear I'm British, so there's a very famous advert. I grew up in Britain about what's called Ron Seal anti-rust paint, and it said one treatment lasts a lifetime. And it feels a little bit like that at times with retreats. So Craig, if you and me met once for 3 days, even if I'm, connected up on Zoom 50 more times a day, I feel like I've known you because I met you. If I've never met you on Zoom, it's just a very different, like, I know you're, what you like, and we chat, and I know how big do I have big or small feet? Somebody, I jokingly told the students, my head is really long and thin because you only ever see people in 2 dimensions. Like, they're like, really? I was like, well, no, but you'd never know, So I think for a lot of onboarding, if you can get folks together, even if it's only once early on, that also tends to help.
No, that's awesome. And I remember, so we're doing some group mastermind forums, and we were chatting over Zoom, and then finally had a dinner, and then for some people it only met over Zoom, and it was just this totally different, you exist in more than 2D. And to your point, I love the point around being intentional, especially early on, to be able to create that connection. Another question coming in.
I'll quickly jump into that and then go to the other question. Interesting, there's a lot of discussions about boards and whether boards should meet remotely or not. And they're kind of, at least Amit Serra, one of my colleagues, has done a lot of research on it. I think the stylized factor from talking to a lot of people on boards of directors is you do want to be meeting every 2 or 3 board meetings. So you don't need to meet everyone, but much like as you said, it's just nice to meet in person. And board members don't make every meeting, and so the idea is, every 2 or 3 times, or big groups, you probably want to have some of these in person. And the majority can be on Zoom, but you just don't want all of them on Zoom.
No, and thank you for sharing that, and agree in terms of just the energy and the connection that people will say, like when you get together in person. Wow, that's different than seeing you on screen. Another question from Ted around what impact do you think remote work will have on urbanization and the geography of work in the long term? Any thoughts or insights?
Yeah, that is a huge question. Actually, I've been looking at this thing. So I'll give you a couple of quick, we have a paper that we just submitted to Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So let's see what happens. But we have very good data for what's called the donut effect. So the donut effect this is like an American donut. There's hollow in the middle, not like the British one that's filled with delicious jam. So Jello, I think. So the donut effect is, if you look at cities like New York, Chicago, San Francisco, DC, London, Berlin, Paris, what happened is a bunch of professionals went to hybrid. And these professionals came to the view, you know what, if I don't have to go into the center of town every day, I may move out to the suburbs. And so in North America, where we have very good data from change of address data and Zillow and other things, you can see about 1 million people shifted out from city centers out to the suburb. I also have data from MasterCard, and we can see that MasterCard spending has fallen in city centers. And people are spending more in the suburb. In fact, I was talking to the board of Panera Bread. This is now going back a couple of years, and they were saying, like, spending is down in the city centers, but is up in the suburbs, so we're doing quite well. What's happening is people are going to get their sandwich at lunch from the shopping mall, or going for lunch meetings, they're just not doing it in the center of town. So is that bad? I'm not sure it's that bad. People that city centers like London breed and Eric Adams, and people are upset about it. On the other hand, the suburbs are booming, and net, Europe and the US, the economies are kind of chuntering along on roughly pre-pandemic trends. The other thing that's interesting for managers, I have a different data set from Gusto that is payroll data. And in the payroll data, you can see where people live and where they work. And we don't have the names, but we have the distances, and they've anonymized it for us. What you can see is post-pandemic, people have moved substantially, are living substantially further away from their employer, about 3 times as far. And you're like, who's moved? Are there really that many people moved? Turns out most of that's from hiring new employees that live a lot further away. So for companies, another facet we see is companies are prepared to, or employees are prepared to work for firms that are 2 to 3 times as far away. And if you're a company, if you can fish 2 to 3 times as far away, your labor market, think of, if you remember, the area of the circle is pi r squared. Basically, if you 3x your radius, the area of the circle is roughly 10x. Companies can now manage and go out and hire over a much larger area, which is good for firms. Individuals can go and work, So the other geography is people are just treating work areas, and companies are treating labor markets as a much bigger area. So yes, the suburbs have done really well. City centers have suffered a bit. Net, I don't think it's so terrible. Living out in the Bay Area before the pandemic, people used to say, San Francisco would become unaffordably expensive. So anything that keep San Francisco property prices down a bit for apartments is probably not such a bad thing.
No, well, thank you. And again, so many comments coming through. Very few questions left. One that I'd love to get your take on: are there any emerging trends that you're really excited about, or research questions that you're really looking forward to digging into when you look into the future of remote work and the future of work?
I mean, another phenomena, I've been talking about the Nike swoosh, which is how work from home dropped a lot from 2020 up to 23. That was post-pandemic. It's been flat for a bit now, 23, 24, 25. And then in the longer run, it's going to start to pick up again. And one driver is technology. The technology is getting a lot better. The other driver that's really interesting is firm age. So if you look at the age of companies, what you see is younger firms, so those born in the last 5 years, have twice the work from home rates as those born before 1980, which is, the many large firms that we know and in some cases love. So what does that tell us? I think that's very positive if you like work from home for the future, because it tells you all of these startups founded in 19, 20, 21, 22, as they grow, they're likely to take that taste for higher levels of work from home. Their CEOs and founders are more used to it and scale it up. So that's, there's two big factors driving this in the long run. I'm kind of watching this going forwards, but what I call cohort effects of young firms growing larger in technology is going to boost work from home in the long run.
No, and that's great. Thank you. Well, this has just been amazing. So much that we covered, and the time has flown by, and there's so many questions. Before we close, Nick, is there anything that we didn't cover today that you would love to shine a light on? Because you do such amazing global consulting and are in the most important conversations around how we can structure our workplaces to be most engaged and happiest and healthiest and productive. So any final thoughts that we missed during our conversation during this time?
No, I'm not sure. What I've been doing, we were talking in the pre-meet, I've been posting the kind of most high impact, interesting nuggets on LinkedIn now. I maybe post 3 times a week. I'm not a heavy poster actually, but I try and post and link to the underlying source. So right now, what I'm looking at, we have some data coming out on super commuters. There's been a big increase in people we define as commuting more than 75 miles a day. Shopping, we see a big increase in online shopping beyond even trends because of work from home. Hiring and firing rates is interesting. Fully remote workers look like they're more likely to be laid off if companies contract. They're also more likely to be harder to expand. They look like a somewhat more flexible margin for companies. There's a lot of research that's kind of what I say in the hopper. And also, as you say, I try and look at what else research comes out. We run this remote work conference once a year, and everything that comes out of that, I try and write it up that I think is relevant for managers and put it out on LinkedIn.
Well, that's wonderful, and thank you. And I've got so many comments here in terms of people loving your passion, your insights, your research, and it's been such a valuable conversation. And as I said at the outset, please do yourself a favor, follow Nick and his fantastic work. Just a treasure trove of data and insights on things and how to navigate these complex questions in terms of, because there's so much nuance. And I think that's why one of the many reasons I was thrilled that we could have this conversation. And for those of you who follow and join the live webinar, thank you so much. We have Kim Scott, the best-selling author of Radical Candor, who will be joining us in June. So stay tuned on LinkedIn to see the invite for that, and look forward to release of this episode. And Nick, again, thank you so much for your time and your insights. It was an absolute pleasure and privilege to talk to you today.
Great, thanks very much, Craig. And I look forward to listening to Kim too.
That's amazing. All right, everyone, until next time, take care. Bye for now.